for the welcome, and I'm delighted to have been invited to speak to you this morning, and thanks to Chris for the invitation. I must apologise for my absence yesterday. I missed a lot of terrific papers, but unfortunately have some conflicting commitments this weekend that I couldn't extricate myself from. But I'm pleased to be here for this morning's session. As you can see, we're going to talk about Galileo. Galileo is a terrific guy to talk about. The Galileo affair is emblematic of a particular view of the historical relations between science and religion. That is, that they're in perennial conflict. And I'll be wanting to suggest to you today that that's a completely false view of history. But the Galileo affair also affords us really interesting insights into scientific change, how it takes place historically, the Galileo affair, and more broadly the Copernican revolution, provided the key instance for Thomas Kuhn's famous notion of scientific revolutions. And the Galileo affair also leads us to questions about the nature of science and what science can actually tell us, whether science puts us directly in contact with reality or not, which was one of the issues that, for those of us who were here on Friday and went to John Pilgrove's session, one of the interesting questions raised there. So I'm going to talk about four basic things in this talk. First of all, the Galileo and the conflict thesis, how Galileo has been used throughout history to exemplify something about the relations between science and religion. Then I'm going to go through the chronology of the Galileo affair, because this really tells us how the story unfolds. And then I'm going to finish up looking at specific issues. What are the scientific issues that were at stake in the Galileo affair, and what were the religious issues? And overall the message will be, whereas the Galileo affair is typically portrayed as science-religion conflict, and perhaps the paradigmatic instance of science-religion conflict in history, in fact what was going on was essentially a conflict between competing scientific conceptions. The Catholic Church supported one particular one, and I will argue that it was perfectly rational for them to do so. So that, in essence, is the story. The second part of it is that in becoming involved in this affair, the Catholic Church was doing something that was quite atypical. That for the most part, the Catholic Church had been and remains a committed sponsor of scientific research. So the Galileo affair was not a science and religion conflict, nor was it the case that the Catholic Church habitually was opposed to science. So let me move on to the first one. How are some of the ways in which Galileo has typically been used to represent or to make some kind of point? And I'm going to start with John Milton, who we know. John Milton in the 30s visited Italy, took the opportunity to visit Galileo, where he was under house arrest in a villa just outside Florence. And here's what he reports. I found Galileo grown old and a prisoner of the Inquisition, that's his spelling there, thinking in astronomy otherwise than what the Franciscans and Dominican licenses had taught. Milton is addressing this in the context of his book Areopagitica, which is about freedom of speech or freedom of the press. And that was the point he wanted to make, that the Catholic Church, he believed, and indeed ecclesiastical authorities generally, he will go on to talk about the situation in England, were a problem for free speech. Milton, incidentally, did not accept the Copernican hypothesis. He did not think that Galileo had got the science right. The principle here was one of freedom of speech. So that's interesting in the first use. But Galileo becomes an important figure in anti-Catholic polemic. That's probably the first way in which the Galileo affair is used. Here, more generally, in the Enlightenment period, Voltaire, where he reports about the great Galileo at this great age, groaned away in the dungeons of the Inquisition for having demonstrated by irrefutable proofs the motion of the earth. So here the notion that Galileo affair can be used for anti-clerical and again anti-Catholic purposes. If we're in the business of spotting the mistakes, Galileo was never in a dungeon, he was never in a prison. Neither did he ever have a convincing proof that the earth was in motion. This was a key point in the Inquisition trials. Galileo never had a proof that the earth was in motion. Here then, one of the classic formulations of the myth of a historical conflict between science and religion in the book by John William Draper. Clue is in the title. This is what this book's about, the history of the conflict between science and religion. And Andrew Dixon White, along with John Draper, was the two figures in the 19th century who first constructed the idea that the way to understand the history of science was to see science as set up in conflict perennially with the forces of religion, and Galileo exemplifies this conflict. So what historians of science now refer to as the conflict thesis, or more pejoratively as the conflict myth, is the invention of the 19th century, and John Draper is one of the key figures in the invention of this myth, along with this other character, Andrew Dixon White. And there we see this story about Galileo. Just three more examples. The recently departed Stephen Hawking, in his brief history of time, again refers to Galileo, and there's probably not a single statement here that's correct. Was he responsible for the birth of modern science? Historians are reluctant to give out prizes, but Galileo would not have got this prize. This prize would probably have gone to Kepler and Newton, okay? Galileo was important. Counterfactually, had he never existed, we still would have had Copernicanism by about the middle of the 17th century as a widely accepted hypothesis. Conflict with the Catholic Church was not central to his philosophy. He attempted to avoid it. He remained a faithful son of the Catholic Church to the day he died, committed Catholic believer. He was the first to argue you could hope to understand how the world works by looking at it. No, actually, Aristotelian science, which was replaced by modern science, was firmly based in common sense observations. Some of Galileo's most important breakthroughs were actually made by intuiting rationally using thought experiments. In fact, he disproved the famous Aristotelian idea that heavy objects, heavy masses will accelerate more quickly than light ones using a thought experiment and not by observation. Okay, so, sorry Stephen, not too much there that's right. In the contemporary popular press, how do we think about Galileo? Just a couple of examples, and this is a typical one here, that wherever anti-evolutionism or religiously motivated anti-evolutionism crops up in America, and as it does from time to time, we have these court cases about whether evolution should be taught in schools or whether creation should get equal measure. Galileo is brought up as, again, a kind of historical instance of the same kind of contemporary conflict that we get with anti-evolutionism. And again, there's not too much right with this statement here. The church held that the earth was flat. No one ever thought that the earth was flat. The flat earth myth was actually invented again in the 19th century. No one ever thought the earth was flat. And then here's the Dark Ages. Historians don't believe there was a Dark Ages much. But the notion that contemporary anti-evolutionism is of a historical piece with this Catholic Inquisition getting on top of Galileo. That's the standard view that I'm going to contest. And then I'll just give you one final example. The Melbourne Age this morning, I was just reading this.
No.
Really, yes, I'm sorry, Melbourne Heights. We'd never read this in the Courier Mail. I'm afraid that the Courier Mail doesn't even rise to this level of... this is being live streamed, isn't it? I'm going to stop right there. But interestingly, Alzheimer's research, and the argument being made here is that there's a kind of standard view about what causes Alzheimer's disease, and if you're trying to get research, and it hasn't got very far as the argument, if you're trying to get research to support an alternative conception, it's quite difficult to get the funding. And so we get the notion that this is like Galileo trying to get a grant out of the Vatican. Now, what's interesting about this is the recognition that the Vatican actually was the chief supporter of astronomical research at this time. They were the people to go to if you wanted to do research in astronomy, them and the Medicis, okay? And Galileo certainly had sponsorship from the latter. Okay, so we see some of the ways in which this Galileo affair has become emblematic of a number of things. So the one I'm interested in is the conflict between science and religion. Let me go through as quickly as I can the relevant chronology. So Copernicus first publishes the notion of a heliocentric hypothesis in 1543. Note the gap. 1543, Galileo is not condemned until 1632. That book does not go on the index until 1616. So interesting gap. What is Copernicus replacing? What's the theory? What's the model that Copernicus is replacing? And famously, it's the Ptolemaic Earth-centered model. But there are two aspects to this. There is Ptolemy's mathematical astronomy, which was a way of calculating mathematically the positions of the planets. And that was also overlapped with an Aristotelian understanding of causally how it was possible for all that to work. So there are actually two sciences of the heavens that are quite distinct in their aims and intentions. One is mathematical, and the other looks at causal explanations. And the causal explanations are really quite interesting. But what Aristotle's natural philosophy has this notion that if you look at the world, what you will see that on Earth, things move in straight lines and they run out of puff and stop. If you look in the heavens, motion is completely different. It seems to be circular. It seems to be eternal. Quite different. So Aristotle distinguishes between terrestrial mechanics and celestial mechanics. Okay? That's a really important difference. How do things move around up there? One of the reasons they can move around so easily is because the heavens is not made of the four elements. The heavens are made of a quint or fifth essence, a quintessence. And that quintessence means that everything that happens up there happens in a very different way to things that happen here. So terrestrial observations of motion are not relevant to the motions of the heavens. That's the important natural philosophical or physics background. And on top of that, Ptolemy has this wonderful set of explanations of how you can make sense of the motions. I'll come to that in a moment. Now, the Aristotelian view makes perfect sense, that if you look at how the stars move, and here's the star trails image, the stars do seem to move in circular orbits. And so the explanation for how that works is that the stars are part of a crystalline sphere that rotates once every 24 hours in a perfect circular motion. It makes quite good sense from the perspective, if your inertial frame of reference is the Earth. And that's this sphere here. So that goes around. So all of these are crystalline spheres that carry around the celestial objects, right? So the celestial objects are mechanically moved. Sometimes you will hear people say, the mechanical worldview happens when Newton comes along in the 17th century. Completely wrong. The Newtonian worldview is not mechanical. It cannot work as a machine. It needs action at a distance. This is a mechanical worldview. It is a machine where the heavenly objects, for the most part, are carried around by these celestial spheres. So that's the natural philosophy, or that's the physics part of it. The mathematical calculations, of course, it becomes the problem with perfect circular motion is that the planets muck it up, because when we observe the planets, unlike the stars that do seem to carry out these perfect circular orbits, the planets go backwards and forwards, and they seem to speed up and slow down. So the Ptolemaic mathematical model has to introduce a very sophisticated set of mechanics to make this work. And it involves not merely epicycles, but putting the Earth slightly off-centre, putting the epicycles slightly off-centre. But if you get that maths right, you get a perfect way to predict where the heavenly bodies are going to be. It works. That's the key thing. And that's how mathematical astronomy at the time was thought. It's a method of calculation. It doesn't claim to be true, but it gives you the results you want. In other words, it was an instrumentalist understanding of astronomy. Copernicus replaces this by placing the sun in the centre, and he places the Earth in the third heaven. Still has the crystalline spheres, still has uniform circular motion, but manages to save a few of the epicycles. So if we compare the mathematical systems, the Copernican model is a little bit simpler than the Ptolemaic model. For most of the 16th century, the predictions were more or less equivalent, okay, but Copernicanism had a certain degree of simplicity to it. Okay, better move along. I put the Council of Trent in here because the religious background is actually important. The Council of Trent is the Catholic Counter-Reformation, is how we regard it. The Catholics took... Luther does nails his thesis to the door in 1517. Catholic Church takes a while to catch up, but here is its formal response in the Council of Trent. Why is this important? It's important because the Council of Trent makes a particular determination about who gets to interpret Scripture And that will become important for the Galileo affair, because when Galileo starts to make claims about the interpretation of Scripture, he's looking like a Protestant, and that's going to be a problem. So that religious background is going to be key to understanding why, after a considerable period of time, the Catholic Church takes an interest in Galileo. And here they are. Well, it probably didn't happen like that, but anyway, that's a bit of a look. 1588, Tycho Brahe publishes this book. Tycho Brahe is another key figure in this. He actually gives us a compromise model that's halfway between Copernicanism and, that is to say, the sun-centered model and the earth-centered model. And what Brahe does is he leaves the earth at the center of the cosmos. He has the sun going around the earth, but he has the planets going around the sun. Okay? The other thing that Tycho does is that he is probably the greatest observational astronomer ever. Didn't have a telescope, set himself up on a little island off the coast of Denmark. But what Tycho also observed was he observed a new star in the heavens. And because in the Aristotelian scheme of things, it was impossible that there be changes in the heavens, new stars typically were regarded as meteorological phenomena, that is to say, things that happened beneath the orbit of the moon. Tycho showed, using parallax, that that could not be the case, that there were changes in the heavens. And that was the first chink in the armour of this Aristotelian worldview, the fact that this supernova was observed. And that was one of the observations also in this very important book. But Tycho Brahe's system also gave you excellent prediction, okay? And ultimately better predictions that you can get from the old Copernican model, sorry, the old Ptolemaic model. I'll say more about that in a moment. Kepler in 1609 publishes his new astronomy, and here Kepler puts his, what we now call his first two laws. Kepler discovers, using the observations of Tycho Brahe, that the best way to understand the motions of the planets is to see them as ellipses, and he's using the orbit of Mercury, which is the most elliptical of the orbits. And so his first law is that the planets move in elliptical paths with the sun at one focus of the ellipse. So it's a Copernican model. He's got elliptical orbits, and his second law, as we now call it, suggests that he also understands that they're moving at different speeds. So you no longer have uniform, you've lost both uniform velocity and you've lost circular velocity. But he shows that if you look at the curve, if you look at the area of the curve carved out by the ellipse, planets, the area will be equal in equal time. So there's a relationship between the orbit of the planet and the area under the curve. It's a beautiful little mathematical demonstration. His third law, which comes later in 1619, shows that the square of the orbital period of a planet is proportional to the cube of the semi-major axis of rotation. It's another beautiful demonstration. And what Newton is going to do when he comes out with the Principia is going to show how each of these three laws is a special case of the inverse square law. So he's going to subsume all of Kepler's laws, and that's the key move. But Kepler is crucially important. Interestingly, Galileo never bought into elliptical orbits. He pretty much ignored what Kepler had to say. And here we have Kepler's wonderful, you see, new astronomy at Nova, and this notion of elliptical orbits. Okay, we better keep going with our timescale. Galileo's first major publication in 1610, The Starry Messenger, and Galileo has got hold of a telescope. And when he turns this telescope to the heavens, the first person really to do this with a telescope, he sees some really quite interesting things. He sees, for a start, craters on the moon. He sees spots on the sun. And these things suggest again that the Aristotelian idea of a perfect heavens, where the heavenly bodies are perfect spheres, is wrong, because we've got craters on the moon, we've got spots on the sun. And there's also the possibility that the sun's rotating, because that's what the sunspots seem to suggest. The telescope will later show the satellites of Jupiter, which again chips away at the old view, because it suggests the Earth is not the only natural centre. that there's some planet out there that is also got things moving around it. So the telescopic evidence is going to be something that chips away at the old model, and he will also see the phases of Venus. The phases of Venus, incidentally, are also explained by Tycho's model, which has, as we know, still got the Earth at the centre. So this is an important breakthrough. People in Rome are quite interested about this. Galileo is encouraged to continue his studies. He's got friends and he's got a few enemies. But here's the thing that starts to get him into trouble. 1613, Galileo writes a letter to Castelli, and what he says in this letter is really quite interesting, because here he addresses biblical arguments against the motion of the Earth, right? And this is a kind of fateful move. This letter will later become the more famous letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, where Galileo sets out the principles of biblical interpretation as he sees them, and why they are actually in favour of his view. So he gets involved in the business of biblical exegesis. In other words, as someone who is a mathematician, that's how he was. He wasn't a natural philosopher or an astronomer, he was a mathematician. He is now engaging in the business of biblical exegesis. Now the arguments are fascinating, because he invokes Augustine, the famous church father, who said in his literal commentary on Genesis, Augustine enunciates this principle: if you've got scripture and you've got demonstrative proofs of natural philosophy, demonstrative proofs of science, you need to interpret scripture allegorically or figuratively or non-literally if there's a contradiction. So Augustine sets up this really important principle that says, if the literal truth of scripture is contradicted by established proofs in natural philosophy, scripture must give way and be interpreted in an allegorical fashion. That's what he says. And Galileo wants to go on and argue that he has got such a proof. He didn't. Right? It's very interesting that in the 1616 trial, which we'll move to right now, there's the letter to Castelli, and here's the claim. This is not the invocation of Augustine, but he wants to say that if there's a contradiction, in some instances, scripture will need to give way. This is all set out much more systematically in the later writing, the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. But what Galileo is doing here is he is engaging in biblical interpretation. He's doing it for himself, and this is, in other words, to start to move into the territory of theologians. That was a mistake. And so this letter is then brought to the attention of the Catholic hierarchy, and Galileo in 1616 is summoned to give an account of himself. Cardinal Bellarmine, a brilliant theologian, highly scientifically literate, gets the scientists, the Jesuit scientists, to do the background work. He gets briefed. They tell him there is no knockdown evidence for the Copernican model. There are problems with the arguments that Galileo puts forward. Bellarmine says to Galileo, if you have a demonstrative proof, we'll invoke the Augustinian condition and we'll think about reinterpreting scripture. But you are not a theologian. Don't tell us how to interpret scripture. That's our job. So Galileo is enjoined then not to teach or defend the doctrine. This little passage here, whether he was allowed to discuss it, turned out to be a point of contention in the later 1632 trial, because Galileo clearly did discuss it, but it was never clear whether Bellarmine had allowed him to discuss it or not. My suspicion is Bellarmine probably wouldn't have a problem with him discussing it, provided that he discussed it as a mathematical model, which was how astronomy was traditionally understood. But as a consequence of this, for the first time, Copernicus's De Revolutionibus goes on the index of prohibited books. Now, just so that you know what this is about, books were not banned or burned, they were simply censored until corrected. So what would happen here is that there would be several passages in Copernicus's De Rev that would need to be corrected before the book could appear on the shelves of the library. Most libraries around the world ignored these prohibitions, and we know that because we can find copies of De Rev, original ones, that were uncorrected in libraries all over the place. So it's very interesting to see how far Vatican edicts about corrections would go. And the Harvard astronomer historian Owen Gingrich has written a book about editions of Dei Rev and has kind of run around and tracked down all of these copies and he's worked out how many were correct and not. Anyway, you're probably not that interested in that. Let me move on. Right. The crunch comes in 1632 when Galileo publishes his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, where he puts the case for the Copernican model, and although it's a dialogue, it's pretty obvious who he's plumping for. Okay, that's going to get him into strife, and it did. So in 1632, he's called to give an account of himself. He is indeed found guilty, not merely of crazy philosophy, that is to say, not merely that his astronomy is wrong, but he's vehemently suspicious, regarded as having come very close to significant heresy. So he's condemned, he recants, he is sentenced to life imprisonment, commuted to house arrest. So he spends the first few months of his arrest in the home of the Archbishop of Siena. If you've been to Siena, it's quite a nice place. And the rest of his time he spends in a villa just outside Florence. If you've been to Florence, anyway. So I'm not suggesting he suffered no hardships, but it wasn't such a bad life. So the facts are clearly Galileo was definitely condemned by the Inquisition for teaching Copernicanism. There's no doubt about that. No doubt about that, and was forced to abjure. But the question is whether this is, as I've said, an instance of science-religion conflict that's typical. I'm going to go on to say that it's not. And was it about science and religion at all? And I'm going to say, look, it's really the science that was crucial in this. But just to go on, sorry, that's the book that got him into strife. He set it up as a dialogue between three individuals representing different positions, and that was a standard way to get around the problem of seeming to be advocating one. But he was rather unsubtle in the way he prosecuted the case for Copernicanism, shall we say, and he didn't fool anyone. Interestingly, this book was licensed. It passed the license, so they didn't have a problem with it. So Galileo had many supporters, including Pope Urban VIII, who eventually was the one running the show when he was condemned. They were good friends, but he managed to alienate him by things he said in this book, making him look rather silly. I've put these last two dates because they're significant. Part of the problem with making a Copernican system work is that the physics wasn't there. You just didn't have the physics to explain how all that could work. And that doesn't happen until Newton comes out with the Principia, which, as we'll see, was only in any case a kind of partial explanation. But Newton gives us the physics that will make a Copernican system work. That doesn't happen until 1687, when it's still controversial. And 1838, I've put that there because stellar parallax, as we're going to see, was a huge problem for the Copernican model, and represented significant evidence against the motion of the Earth. Okay. So, two things to go. I'm going to talk about the scientific issues and the religious issues, and I'll go through these fairly quickly. But the question about the status of astronomy, I've already hinged on. As I've said, astronomy was an instrumental discipline primarily. And what Galileo was doing was not merely making a claim about astronomy, he was actually trying to change the status of astronomy. So there wasn't just an instrumental way of calculating where the planets were, it was a real description of what was happening in the heavens. And that was a big change. Okay? So to see the standard view, here's the somewhat notorious preface that was added to Copernicus's Dei Rev by Osiander, but it's a standard view of what astronomy was. And as you can see there, what was astronomy? It was not about cause. It was not about a causal explanation of what was going on. It was about computation. And the hypotheses need not be true or even probable. That's the key thing. It was not after truth. It was after predictability, and there's a big difference, right? People often get these conflated. They say, if your theory predicts something, it must be true. Completely wrong. History of science is replete with instances of theories that give you a fantastic prediction, but are subsequently overturned by theories that posit quite different realities and might give you slightly better prediction. But predictability is not a guarantee of mapping onto truth. These guys knew that. They were all over that. Okay, and they understood that astronomy gives you predictability, and that's all you need. Simplicio is the character in Galileo's dialogue who represents the conservative position. These words were actually the words of Pope Urban VIII, who said to Galileo, when you talk about that, when you talk about your model, this is how you need to couch your explanations of it. Using epistemic modesty, and epistemic modesty on the basis of the fact that God can instantiate situations in any number of ways. He can cause things to happen in numerous ways, and our human capacity is limited in our ability to intuit the causal mechanisms that God might employ at any single time. Okay? This is the problem of, in the philosophy of science, the problem of overdetermination. Okay? It's a problem of overdetermination. There's a very interesting book on this problem that's just come out last year that says something like, theories will always be overdetermined, by which I mean there will always be a number of plausible accounts of the phenomena, partly because human beings can only conceive of a limited range of alternatives. Now what's interesting is that that philosophy of science claim made last year is precisely the position of the Catholic hierarchy in the 16th and 17th centuries. Okay? So that there's a theological reason for supporting astronomy as an instrumental activity. Okay? A lot more could be said about that, but I better move on. Okay. Newton, we know Newton's most famous book where he sets out the universal law of gravity. This is it. Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy is what it says. We often skip right past the title, but if you think back to what I was saying at the beginning, natural philosophy provides causal explanations and mathematics just gives you predictability in the standard understandings of how these disciplines relate. That's why astronomy and maths were different from natural philosophy. And interestingly, Galileo was only ever a mathematician. He wanted to be a natural philosopher, but they never gave him that label because there was a status issue there. But the significance of Newton's title is he wants to bring together mathematics and natural philosophy, and he says they're actually about the same thing. Okay? So this is quite a remarkable statement in this title itself, that we're going to bring together maths, and maths for the first time will give us a realistic account of what's happening in the heavens. But what drops out of this, and what we don't often, we don't often fully compute with regard to Newton, that causation has gone. The idea of a causal explanation of what's happening is completely absent from Newton's geometrical account of what's happening in the heavens. And if you ask Newton the question, what is gravity? It's a question that he never ever answers, except in a few private letters where he says gravity is God. But he has no way of moving the planets around. You've got this spooky action in the distance, right? And Leibniz, the German philosopher, criticises Newton precisely for that. So we've got a kind of suspension of disbelief that's necessary for Newton to bring these two things together. And that's part of why it's very hard for people to conceptualise a Copernican model, not merely when they don't have Newtonian physics, but when they still have an idea that science should be giving you causal explanations, because at this point it's not, it's given them up. Okay, so false dichotomy. So Galileo just plays the old trick of setting up his Copernican model with the old Ptolemaic model, completely neglects the compromise alternative, the Tychonic model, which gave just as good an account of most of the observed phenomena, but without the scientific problem of putting the Earth into motion. I'll say what those scientific problems were. So this is a really fascinating book by Riccioli called The New Almagest. The Almagest was Ptolemy's astronomical book. So this is just another new astronomy kind of book. And what the illustration shows us here is, don't have the pointer, so I'm going to trot over here. Here is the old Earth-centered Ptolemaic model. It's out of the picture. But here is the comparison between a Copernican model and a Tychonic model, and what Riccioli is saying is the evidence supports this one. And what Galileo had tried to do was to leave that out of the picture and compare these two and say that's better. Well, he might have been right, but if you put that in the picture, you've actually got a model that is scientifically quite respectable. And that's the one that really most scientists support from the beginning of the 17th century. So if you ask how many people at the turn of the 17th century were Copernicans, we think about 10. We think about 10. So the idea that the scientific consensus was behind Galileo is completely wrong. It wasn't. And that's partly because the power of the Tychonic model, that third option. Now, I'm going to talk about two scientific problems in the thing. This fascinating book comes out in the middle of the 17th century, has over 100 arguments for and against Copernicanism. There are 70 against Galileo's model, Copernicus' model, and about 40 in favour. So you can see where Riccioli is coming out, and that gives you the illustration there. You can see where he's going to come out. Interestingly, of the arguments against Copernicanism, only 3 were religious ones. So most of the arguments against Copernicanism are scientific ones. The 2 most powerful ones were the argument from star size and stellar parallax. So let me just quickly run you through this. And there's the Coriolis effect I won't talk about too much because we're running out of time. But I shouldn't have to labour this. Maybe I do have to labour this audience what parallax is, right? But you can try this at home, folks. But if you put 2 fingers up like this and you move your head, the relative positions of these will change with respect to each other. So here's the thing: if the Earth's in motion, the relative positions of the fixed star should appear to move, right? Stellar parallax will suggest that if the Earth's in motion, relative positions of the stars will shift. So here's the diagram. A close star will change its position with respect to distant stars if the Earth's in motion. That's what we should observe if the Earth's moving. Do we observe that in the 17th century? No, we don't. We don't. There's 2 reasons why we mightn't observe it, right? One is that the Earth is not in motion. The other reason is, if your arms were long enough, if things are a long way away, parallax is going to be difficult to detect. Right? If things are a long way away, parallax is going to be difficult to detect. As I said earlier, stellar parallax was detected in the early 19th century. But Tycho Brahe figured out how far away the stars would have to be, right, before you couldn't detect stellar parallax. He calculated that, said this is a possibility. But the problem was, for them to be that far away, for us to see them in the way we see them, they would have to be huge. And this is because when stars appear to us in both the naked eye and in optical telescopes, they appear bigger than they are. So Tycho had figured out that stars look like they're about 1 minute of arc, one minute of arc, and large stars even 3 minutes. Okay. If you do the maths and you calculate the distance they have to be before you can't detect stellar parallax, the size they would be the orbit of Saturn. Not the size of Saturn, the orbit of Saturn. This seemed implausibly large, right? Now, when Tycho wrote about these objections, some people wrote back and said God could create stars that were that big. So there was a theological argument in favour of Copernicanism. Right? It was a theological argument. But that's where the debate went. So the point I'm trying to make here is that if you accept the scientific evidence, it's going to look, in the 17th century, it's going to look like the Earth's not in motion. You're going to have a whole stack of other reasons to think that this is a good theory if you've got this as an objection. And the other one I said, the Coriolis effect, some of you will know that's what gives us our weather patterns. But if the Earth is rotating, we should expect that to have ballistic effects. If you're firing a cannon to the north and the Earth's rotating, there should be a ballistic effect. It's not observed, right? Again, we just didn't have the sophistication to pick it up. But when the Germans were firing their huge Paris gun in the First World War, it was 70 miles outside Paris. They actually had to make allowances for the Coriolis effect. And snipers today, I'm told, depending on which direction they're firing, also, if they're firing long distances, they also have to take into consideration the rotation of the Earth. Okay. But again, these effects that were predicted that were not seen. Right? So, and here you can see mathematician in the middle of the 17th century. But Copernican model would suggest we need to point our cannons in a different direction. In fact, we know our cannons don't have to be pointed in that direction, evidence against Copernicanism. So the point here is the Catholic Church is not jumping in an anti-scientific and an anti-science way and saying, you guys are wrong, you're wrong. They have a huge amount of scientific evidence that suggests the Earth's not in motion and that therefore Copernicanism can't work. And the physics of motion, I've already referred to Newton. And finally, the last thing, does Galileo have a proof? In the dialogue, he thought he did, and it was his argument from the tides. It was completely wrong. He should have known it was wrong, because there are 2 tides every 24 hours. On the logic of his own argument, the rotation of the Earth on its axis in 24 hours should only give you 1 tide. So he thought he had a demonstrative proof, he didn't. Okay, so my suggestion here is that the Catholic Church was pretty much on the side of science. It wasn't against science in suggesting that there are problems with Copernicanism. Very quickly, what were the religious problems? And we've already talked about biblical interpretation. When Galileo starts to interpret the Bible to support his view, he gets into strife. And here's the reason. The Council of Trent, conscious of the fact that Protestants were reading Scripture to refute them, say, we are the guys who control the interpretation of Scripture. So the religious problem is not to do with anything intrinsically problematic about a sun-centered cosmos. The problem is that Galileo is interpreting Scripture to support his views. He's moving into the sphere of biblical hermeneutics. He's looking like a Protestant, and he's challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. That's why he gets into strife on religious grounds. And as I say, nothing to do with the intrinsic science involved. Here are the relevant passages. You're probably familiar with them. If you read the letter to Castelli and the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, Galileo has some very interesting ways of reading them, but these do look like geocentric suggestions, which I don't think anyone particularly exercised by now. The other thing that you often hear is that the religious issue is the demotion of human beings. They're moved out of the centre of the cosmos. And I could give you a lecture on this, but I won't. All I can say, it's completely wrong and false. The centre of the universe was the last place you wanted to be. That's where the dregs of the universe were. By moving the Earth into the heavens, moving the Earth into the third heaven, that was actually a promotion. And you get some sense, here's a 14th century description, that the real place, the real action is in the heavens. And this model here gives you the kind of figurative centrality of what's most important. So although the Earth, hell of course, as you can see here, is right in the middle. So that's the worst place to be, hell, right in the middle of the cosmos. If you bung Earth up into the heavens, that's a promotion. But the best place to be is out here, and that's where God is, and that's why if you reverse them, you get that view. So, cut a long story short, don't believe stories that you will read in Freud, for example, about, when Copernicus came along, the big issue with the human being's dignity was because they weren't being demoted. Okay, it was a promotion. Right. So, and finally, then I want to say that the Catholic Church, in terms of its approach to science, has never ever been anti-science, and indeed during this period, for something like 400 or 500 years before we got research universities up and running, the Catholic Church was not merely the most prominent supporter, but probably supported more astronomical research than any other single institution. Right? This is up until about the beginning of the 19th century. And we can see we've got here's the Vatican Observatory. In cathedrals, we see these meridian lines, which were put there for astronomical research. So the idea that Catholicism is intrinsically opposed to science is a complete nonsense. Okay, summing up then very quickly, because I know it's morning tea time very soon. It's really the science that is at the heart of the Galileo affair, and the Church was not anti-science. In fact, the scientific consensus supported what it was up to. Galileo had no proof, and proof was a crucial part of science then in a way that surprisingly is not now. And the Church had always said to Galileo, if you have a proof, we will change our interpretation of Scripture. But he never had a proof, and you can see why. the context of the Protestant Reformation is important. That's why no one bothered about Copernicus until 1616. Okay, Galileo was no diplomat. As I say, he insulted the Pope, and that was had been his good friend. That was unfortunate. Catholic Church has always supported scientific research. Interesting, it was the Protestants who first made trouble with Galileo. Who the Protestants? Anyway, and then we see, of course, that Galileo, the story of Galileo, is subsequently incorporated into this larger mythology of a perennial conflict between science and religion. So I'll stop there and I'll leave you with, this is where Galileo spent his last years. And that's the view. You can still go there today. It's just outside Florence. So let me finish up there.